The morning rain had a way of turning the highway asphalt into a dark, mirror-like surface, reflecting the overcast gray sky above. Agent Daniel Vance sat in his unmarked sedan, parked just across the street from a weathered diner on the edge of a sleepy Oregon County line. His engine hummed softly, a low rumble against the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers. He had been on the road for 36 straight hours, tracking a ghost through 3 states, and his eyes burned with a fatigue that no amount of synthetic cold air could wash away. All he wanted was a hot cup of plain black coffee, 10 minutes of quiet, and a moment to clear the fog in his mind before pushing south toward the coast. He stepped out of the vehicle, pulling the collar of his jacket up against the chill dampness. The neon sign above the diner flickered with a faint buzz, casting a reddish glow onto the wet gravel. Inside, the air smelled of stale grease, fried bacon, and roasted coffee beans. It was the kind of roadside spot where strangers were noticed immediately, but Daniel had spent 15 years perfecting the art of blending into the background. He wore worn jeans, a faded canvas jacket, and a neutral posture that projected nothing more than a tired traveler passing through. He took a seat in a booth tucked away in the back corner, positioning himself with his back to the wall, giving him a clear view of both the front door and the counter. The diner was nearly empty save for an elderly couple sharing a pie at the counter and a tired-looking waitress wiping down tables with a damp cloth. Daniel caught her eye, gave a polite nod, and held up one finger. She smiled faintly, grabbed a pot of coffee, and walked over to fill his mug without a word. The steam rose from the mug, carrying the rich, sharp aroma that felt like a lifeline. He wrapped his calloused hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat sink into his skin, feeling the quiet rhythm of the rural morning start to settle his nerves. That quiet shattered when the heavy glass front door swung open, setting off a small brass bell that chimed sharply against the ambient hum of the room. 2 local sheriff's deputies walked in, their wet boots squeaking against the linoleum floor. They were dressed in crisp tan uniforms, heavy utility belts jingling with metal cuffs and radios. The older officer, a man with broad shoulders, graying temples, and a silver star pinned to his chest, led the way. Behind him was a younger officer, tall and lean, whose eyes darted around the room with a subtle, jittery energy. They slid into the booth directly behind Daniel's, their backs separated only by the thin wooden padding of the bench. Daniel kept his head down, taking a slow sip of coffee, but his trained instincts immediately dialed in on their presence. In his line of work, listening wasn't just a habit, it was a survival mechanism. He expected them to discuss local sports, shift schedules, or the miserable weather settling over the county. But as soon as the waitress left them 2 mugs of coffee and walked away, the older deputy leaned forward, lowering his voice into a gravelly whisper that barely carried above the hum of the refrigerator. The older officer cleared his throat, his breath heavy. He didn't make it to the state line, Marcus. We found the truck down in the ravine off Old Mill Road. The younger deputy, Marcus, let out a shaky breath, the sound of his coffee mug rattling against the saucer. Is the bag still in the vehicle? Tell me it was still in the back. No, the older officer replied, his voice dropping an octave lower, cold and tight. The cab was torn apart. The latch was broken. Whoever got to him first took everything, including the hard drive. If Sheriff Miller finds out before we clear this up, we aren't just losing our badges. We're going to end up in the same ditch. Daniel set his mug down on the table, making sure it didn't make a sound. The warmth in his chest turned to ice. The name Marcus hit him with a sudden, jarring recognition. 3 months ago, while deep undercover in a federal task force investigating systemic corruption along the Pacific Northwest transit corridors, Daniel had come across an encrypted ledger. It mentioned a localized network running protection for illegal cross-border shipments, operated by 2 law enforcement officers using the call signs Sentry and Guard. He had spent weeks trying to put names to those calls, but the trail had gone cold when his primary informant vanished into thin air. Now, sitting in an obscure roadside diner in the middle of nowhere, those missing pieces were aligning themselves in real time right behind him. Daniel reached beneath his jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold leather of his concealed holster, ensuring his weapon was ready. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the small reflection in the dark, rainy windowpane beside his booth. In the distorted reflection, he could see the silhouette of the older deputy nervously tapping a thick silver ring against his mug. "We have 2 hours before the morning shift hits that stretch of road," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "If someone else finds the driver's body before we retrieve the drive, the federal boys are going to be crawling all over this county. You know how close they were last week." "The driver isn't dead," the older deputy said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. A heavy silence stretched between the two booths. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, every muscle in his body coiling tight like a spring. Marcus gasped softly. "What do you mean he's not dead? You said the truck went over the cliff." "He crawled out," the older officer said quietly. "I followed the blood trail for 50 yards into the brush before the rain started washing it away. He's hurt bad, but he's alive. And he's heading toward the old train depot. He thinks he can hide there until the morning freight comes through." "Then we go there now and finish it," Marcus urged, his chair scraping slightly against the floor. "No," the older deputy cut in sharply. "We don't shoot him. We make it look like an accident. He was high, lost control, ran off the road, and froze in the woods. If we put a bullet in him, the medical examiner raises red flags. We find him, we get the drive, and we let the cold take care of the rest. Nobody asks questions about a runaway driver who died of hypothermia." Daniel sat frozen in his booth, his mind racing through calculations at lightning speed. His primary federal mandate was surveillance and intelligence gathering. He was alone, out of his jurisdiction, without backup, and operating without official local authorization. If he stepped in now, he risked compromising a multi-year federal operation that reached far beyond this single county. But if he did nothing, an injured man hiding in the freezing Oregon rain would be hunted down and left to die in the dark within the hour. The two deputies stood up from their booth, the sound of their heavy leather belts creaking as they adjusted their gear. Daniel kept his gaze locked on his coffee cup, maintaining the image of an exhausted, harmless traveler absorbed in his own world. As they walked past his booth toward the exit, the older deputy paused for a fraction of a second, his sharp eyes sweeping over Daniel's quiet frame. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't shift his weight, and kept his breathing steady and slow. After an agonizing moment, the officer turned and pushed through the door into the pouring rain, Marcus close behind him. Through the rain-streaked window, Daniel watched their marked patrol cruiser pull out of the gravel lot, its headlights cutting through the gray gloom as it accelerated down the highway toward the northern ridge. The moment their taillights disappeared around the bend, Daniel pulled a $20 bill from his pocket, tossed it onto the table, and moved toward the door with quiet, controlled urgency. He stepped back out into the freezing downpour, the cold water stinging his face and washing away the last remnants of his physical exhaustion. He jumped into his sedan, fired up the engine, and pulled out onto the highway, keeping a safe, invisible distance behind the faint red glow of the cruiser ahead. His hand rested on his encrypted satellite phone resting on the passenger seat. He dialed his senior handler in D.C., holding the phone to his ear as the dial tone rang twice before a familiar, stern voice answered. "Vance," Director Sarah Hayes said, her voice crisp despite the late hour back east. "Tell me you have a location on the transit network." "Director, change of plans," Daniel said smoothly, keeping his eyes glued to the dark road ahead. "I just crossed paths with 2 local officers tied to the Pacific Corridor pipeline. They're moving on a wounded key witness right now near the old rail yard off Old Mill Road. The driver has the primary hard drive." There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "Daniel, you are off-grid and unassisted. You know the protocol. Do not engage local law enforcement alone. Maintain visual contact, drop a locator beacon, and wait for the regional SWAT team out of Portland. They are 90 minutes away." "In 90 minutes, that witness will be dead, Director," Daniel replied, his voice firm, unwavering. "They aren't planning to arrest him. They're going to let him freeze in the woods to cover their tracks. I can't sit back and watch that happen. If you blow your cover now, Vance, the entire task force comes down like a house of cards, Hayes warned, her tone sharp with absolute authority. If those cops realize who you are, you won't survive the night. I copy, Director, Daniel said quietly. Sending my coordinates now. He hung up the phone, tossed it onto the seat, and killed his headlights, relying only on the dim ambient light of the overcast morning and his knowledge of tactical driving. He turned off the main highway onto a rutted, unpaved logging route that wound upward through the dense pine forest. The tall trees stretched up into the gray sky like jagged teeth, their heavy branches dripping with rain. Up ahead, through the dense foliage, he caught the faint red flicker of brake lights coming to a stop near an abandoned wooden structure shadowed by the mountain. Daniel pulled his vehicle onto a muddy pull-off tucked behind a thick stand of fir trees, killing the engine entirely. Silence descended on the car, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the metal roof. He reached into his glove compartment, pulled out his tactical sidearm, checked the magazine with practiced, smooth motions, and racked around into the chamber. He slid the weapon into his shoulder holster, pulled his dark waterproof jacket tight around his chest, and opened the door into the wet, freezing air. He moved through the trees with silent, deliberate steps, staying low and using the dense underbrush for cover. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine needles and damp earth. A quarter-mile ahead, the old rail depot stood like a decaying skeleton against the gray sky, its wooden beams rotted and sagging, surrounded by rusted tracks overgrown with wild blackberries and thorns. The sheriff's cruiser was parked near the perimeter fence, its engine idling quietly, white exhaust rising into the chill air. Through the break in the trees, Daniel saw the older officer step out of the cruiser carrying a heavy tactical flashlight, its bright white beam cutting through the gloom. Marcus followed behind, holding an iron crowbar, his shoulders hunched against the rain. They walked toward a set of rusted metal double doors leading into the main warehouse of the depot. Check the outer perimeter first, the older deputy commanded, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp air. If he's inside, he's trapped. There's no back exit that isn't boarded up. What if he has a weapon, Frank? Marcus asked, his voice tight with rising panic. He was hauling high-level gear. What if he shoots? He took a 40-foot fall down a ravine, Marcus, Frank said coldly. He'll be lucky if he can stand up, let alone aim a gun. Now spread out and keep your light low. We don't want anyone driving down the county road seeing bright flashes inside. Daniel slipped past the outer chain-link fence through a torn section of wire, keeping his boots planted firmly on the soft earth to avoid making noise. He reached the side wall of the decaying warehouse, pressing his back against the damp wood. Through a cracked pane of glass high above his head, he could hear the distinct sound of dragged footsteps echoing inside the cavernous space. Someone was inside, breathing heavily, gasping with agonizing effort. Daniel crept toward a rusted side access door that hung slightly off its hinges. He slipped through the gap, stepping into the dark, cold interior of the warehouse. The air inside smelled of rust, old engine oil, and dry rot. Rain dripped from high holes in the corrugated metal roof, creating a steady, rhythmic clicking sound on the concrete floor below. In the faint light filtering through the high windows, Daniel spotted a dark trail of fresh wet smears leading toward a stack of wooden crates at the far end of the hall. Hidden behind those crates, crouched in the shadow, was a figure curled into a tight ball. The man was shivering violently, clutching a dark, water-resistant canvas bag against his chest with both hands. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, his face pale and smeared with mud and dried blood. Daniel moved forward with ghost-like precision, keeping his weapon low, lowering his center of gravity. As he approached the crates, the injured man suddenly flinched, pulling a small pocket knife with a shaking, blood-stained hand, his eyes wide with wild, desperate terror. Don't come any closer," the man rasped, his voice barely a breath, teeth chattering violently from the hypothermia settling into his limbs. "I'll kill you. I swear I will." "Lower the knife," Daniel whispered softly, stepping out of the deep shadows so the man could see his face, keeping his body language open and non-threatening. "I'm not with the men outside. My name is Daniel. I'm a federal agent. I heard them talking at the diner." The man stared at Daniel, his eyes searching the agent's calm face, searching for any sign of betrayal. The trembling in his hands worsened, the small knife slipping from his frozen fingers and clattering harmlessly onto the cold concrete floor. They ran me off the road," the driver sobbed softly, a tear cutting a clear path through the dirt on his cheek. "They killed my brother last month, and now they came for me. They want what's in the bag." "I know," Daniel said gently, kneeling beside the injured man and checking his pulse. It was rapid and weak. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay completely silent. Can you stand?" "My leg. I think it's broken," the man whispered, clutching the canvas bag tighter against his ribs. "The drive, everything is in here. Names, bank accounts, dates. Sheriff Miller, Deputy Frank, all of them. They've been running the whole operation out of the county station for 6 years." Before Daniel could respond, the heavy front doors of the warehouse creaked open with a harsh metal groan, sending a shaft of gray morning light slicing through the gloom. The heavy footsteps of Frank and Marcus echoed across the open space, accompanied by the bright, sweeping beams of their flashlights. "Come out, boy." Frank's voice echoed off the rusted rafters, loud and terrifyingly clear. "We know you're in here. Save yourself the trouble and hand over the bag, and we'll make sure you get a warm blanket and a ride to the hospital." Marcus's voice followed, sharper and far less controlled. "We don't want to do this, man. Just leave the drive on the floor and walk out. Nobody has to die today." Daniel looked down at the injured driver, placing a firm, reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "Stay down behind these crates. No matter what happens, do not move and do not make a sound." "What are you going to do?" the driver whispered in terror. "I'm going to finish my coffee," Daniel said softly, a dark, calm flicker in his eyes. He stood up, stepping quietly into the shadows of a massive steel support beam 30 feet away from the driver's hiding spot. He drew his sidearm, holding it in a low ready position, his breathing slowing to a deep, controlled rhythm. Across the wide warehouse floor, the 2 flashlight beams bounced off rusted machinery and discarded oil drums, sweeping closer to the stacked crates with every passing second. "He's over here, Frank." Marcus called out, his light catching the dark trail of blood on the concrete floor leading directly toward the wooden crates. "The blood trail goes right behind those pallets." Frank stepped into view, his service weapon drawn and held with 2 steady hands, the bright beam of his flashlight illuminating the damp concrete. "End of the line, kid," Frank said coldly, stepping closer. "Put your hands where I can see them." "He's not the one you should be looking for, Deputy," Daniel's voice cut through the dark warehouse like a steel blade, quiet, clear, and perfectly calm. Frank and Marcus spun around instantly, their flashlight beams sweeping across the room until they locked onto Daniel standing in the shadows beside the steel beam, his federal badge displayed prominently against his dark jacket, his weapon trained squarely on Frank's chest. "Federal Agent Daniel Vance," Daniel said smoothly, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Put your weapons on the ground slowly. Both of you." Marcus gasped, his flashlight beam shaking wildly as he looked between Daniel and his senior officer. "Frank. Frank, he's a Fed." "Oh God, they know, they knew the whole time." "Shut up, Marcus." Frank barked, his eyes narrowing into cold slits as he kept his gun aimed directly at Daniel. He didn't drop his weapon. Instead, a dark, bitter smile spread across his weathered face. "A federal agent? Alone? In my county, off the books, with no backup in sight? You took a wrong turn, Agent Vance. Your network is compromised, Frank," Daniel replied calmly, not taking his eyes off the front sight of his pistol. "The Portland office already has your station surrounded. If you pull that trigger, you aren't just committing murder, you're signing your own execution warrant." "You're lying," Frank sneered, taking a slow step to the side to create an angle. If you had backup, they'd be breaking down those doors right now. You're out here by yourself, running on a hunch you picked up over a cup of diner coffee. And now you're going to die in the dark just like this driver. Check your radio, Frank, Daniel said softly. A sudden, sharp burst of static erupted from the radio clipped to Marcus's shoulder, cutting through the tense silence of the warehouse. A panicked voice came through the speaker, distorted but loud enough to echo off the walls. All units, all units. Dispatch to Unit 4. We have federal vehicles entering the county perimeter from the North Highway. Sheriff says shred everything, repeat, shred. The radio cut off in a blast of harsh white noise. Marcus dropped his flashlight, the heavy plastic casing cracking against the concrete floor, sending light bouncing wildly across the ceiling. Frank, we have to go. We have to get out of here now. Hold your ground. Frank screamed, his composure snapping entirely as he swung his weapon toward Daniel and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot roared through the enclosed space like a cannon shot, the muzzle flash illuminating the darkness for a fraction of a second. Daniel threw himself sideways behind the heavy steel support beam a split second before the bullet slammed into the metal with a deafening screech of tearing iron. Daniel rolled across the concrete, coming up on one knee, and fired 2 precise rounds into the space beside Frank's feet. The heavy lead ricocheted off the floor, sending concrete dust and sparks flying into the air. Marcus panicked completely, dropping his weapon to the floor with a loud metallic clatter, throwing his hands above his head and dropping to his knees. I surrender. Don't shoot. I surrender. Frank ducked behind a rusted forklift, panting heavily, his face slick with sweat. You coward, Marcus. Get up. It's over, Frank. Daniel called out, his voice echoing from a new position in the shadows, moving with terrifying speed and silence. Drop the gun. There is no way out of this warehouse. Frank looked back toward the open front doors, then down at his kneeling partner, and finally into the deep, dark shadows where Daniel was hidden. He knew the federal task force was minutes away. His chest heaved, his hand trembling as he held his pistol tight against his ribs. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the warehouse was the rhythmic drip of rain from the ceiling and the frantic gasps of the wounded driver behind the crates. With a heavy, bitter curse, Frank tossed his gun out onto the open concrete floor, where it skidded to a stop 10 feet away. He slowly raised his arms into the air, his eyes dark with defeat and venom. You got lucky, Fed, Frank spat, his voice trembling with rage. You got lucky. Daniel stepped out of the darkness, keeping his weapon trained on Frank until he reached the discarded handguns, kicking them far out of reach. Within 6 minutes, the thunderous sound of heavy federal vehicles roared outside the warehouse, bright red and blue lights flashing through the cracked windows, illuminating the dark interior with vibrant color. A dozen armed federal officers rushed through the doors, securing the scene, handcuffing Frank and Marcus, and calling for emergency medical technicians to attend to the wounded driver. Director Sarah Hayes walked into the warehouse, her long coat damp from the rain, her eyes sweeping over the captured deputies and the secure evidence bag being carried out by a forensic agent. She walked up to Daniel, who was leaning against a concrete pillar, holding a fresh bottle of water given to him by an EMT. You disobeyed a direct order, Vance, Hayes said, her voice stern, though a faint, rare smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. You could have been killed out here alone. The driver survived, Director, Daniel said quietly, watching the paramedics carefully wheel the injured man out on a stretcher toward an awaiting ambulance. And we got the entire network down in one morning. Hayes looked at him for a long moment, nodding slowly. The evidence on that drive implicates the entire regional ring. It's bigger than we imagined. You did good work today, Daniel. Go get some rest. Daniel walked out of the warehouse into the crisp, clean air. The heavy downpour had finally stopped, replaced by a soft, misty drizzle. The morning sun was beginning to break through the thick gray clouds on the eastern horizon, casting a warm golden light across the wet trees and the long stretch of highway ahead. He walked back to his sedan, opening the door and looking back at the old rail depot one last time. He realized how close a single moment, a chance stop for a quick cup of coffee on a rainy morning, had come to changing everything. Sometimes the difference between justice and tragedy wasn't a massive tactical plan or a complex operation, it was simply being present, listening closely, and having the courage to act when no one else would. He got into his car, started the engine, and pulled back onto the open road, driving toward the warm light breaking through the morning sky.